I'm starting again. If I'm still not audible, send your hundreds of messages once more. I began by saying that the topic was given to me by the organizers of a robust bureaucracy. I have not been a bureaucrat in India. I was one as an international civil servant at the United Nations. But I am certainly somebody who has seen the bureaucracy close up, having been in Indian politics now for almost a dozen years, and having served as a minister twice in UPA 2. I've worked with IFS, IAS, and IPS and IRS officers in various capacities, particularly when I was an MOS in the External Affairs Ministry and then in the Human Resources Development Ministry. So all I can say is that some people are able to hear me, and my apologies to the rest. We'll put up an audible video later. I better get on with the talk. So according to Max Weber, bureaucracy is a universal social phenomenon and the means of carrying community action to rationally ordered societal action, which is a fancy way of saying is that bureaucracy is everywhere. When people get together and they set up governments, you really need to have actions of the government undertaken in ways that affect all of society, and that is something that can only happen when you have an effective bureaucracy. Now, whatever kind of system you live in, it can be a Soviet communist government, it can be a totalitarian despotism of the fascist era, it can be the most liberal bureaucracy, you still have to be governed by a bureaucracy of some kind, somewhere or the other. And the truth is that all of us in dealing with government officials are dealing with bureaucracies, local government, state government, national government, the whole works. Now, what are the defining features of a bureaucracy? Bureaucrats are meant to be neutral and non-political. They have to carry out whatever policies are decided by the government of the day, irrespective of their personal political views. And the whole point is that because they are neutral and non-political, they are a permanent civil service. Politicians will come and go in democracies. You're elected, you're fired, you're replaced, you're promoted, whatever. But the bureaucracy is there until retirement. And therefore, the good news absolutely is that from a bureaucrat's point of view, they have a working lifetime's tenure. Now, what are the arguments for the need for a robust bureaucracy in public administration? Well, bureaucrats actually do get involved in policy formulation. Politicians like to think that we, the politicians, make policy, but in fact, the bureaucrats have three ways in which they make policy. The first is the power of suggestion. A good bureaucrat will come to your minister and say, "Sir, have you thought about this, or can we do it this way? Or, sir, I read about this being done somewhere else. What do you think?" And the suggestive role is very important. The second role is the analytical role. A government or a minister or a political party will say, "This is a program." The bureaucrat will analyze that program and suggest the best ways in which it can be implemented. And the third role is the interpretive role. Let's say a law is passed by the parliament. The bureaucrats are the ones who get to interpret it and decide how it should apply in the ground realities of our country or of the particular portfolio that they're working in. Now, when you look at the way in which policies are implemented in our country, the members of the bureaucracy can give shape to the stated policies through the exercise of choice and judgment in administering them to achieve the goal of welfare. So again, the broad policy is stated by the political party, by the government, by the politician, in this case, let's say the minister, but the bureaucratic implementer is the one who has to apply on a daily basis his or her gray cells, his or her sensible judgment, saying how the policy can be applied in order to benefit large numbers of people. And this is particularly significant when we come to the area of delegated legislation, because the lawmaking power is supposed to be with the legislatures, namely MPs like myself, those who are in Parliament. We pass the laws. But in fact, a law is really a framework. The way in which the law is to be implemented is decided by the bureaucracy writing the rules and regulations that need to be applied in implementing the law. And what's interesting about that is this power of delegated legislation is one which is considerable, because in theory, those rules have been placed on the table of Parliament for 30 days. But in my 11 years experience, we've never discussed any rules, because even if an MP requests saying we want to discuss the rules attached to such and such law, the fact is that we don't actually discuss them because the government of the day doesn't want them discussed. So the bureaucrats have enormous power in writing rules that in effect do not get seriously reviewed by the legislature in our country. Another very important role of bureaucracy in our country is crisis management, because of course someone as relatively young as a district magistrate, a collector, is somebody who's handling a riot, who's handling a disturbance, who's in charge of relief during a natural disaster. And these are young officers, often in their early 30s, early to mid-30s, and crisis management becomes a key function of an Indian bureaucrat. And finally, they are the real visible link between the public and the government. Yes, the politicians, like me, like to think we are. We are elected, we go among the people. But because we are legislators as MPs, we don't have an executive role. It is the bureaucracy that has an executive role, and therefore you're the ones interfacing with the public that's benefiting from your decisions and actions. In other words, the public comes and sees a bureaucrat when they want a ration card, when they want an application processed, when they want to apply for everything from a birth certificate to a death certificate. It's not a politician, it's a bureaucrat. And therefore, in many ways, bureaucrats are the key link between the public and the government. Now, citizen-centric governance is supposed to be the logic of our democracy. That is, the object of our state, which is not fully a welfare state yet, but which has a lot of welfare provisions built into its functioning. And of course, because the state's objective is welfare, citizens are supposed to be at the center of public administration. And Sardar Patel, the first Home Minister of independent India, was a man who essentially invented the IAS. He converted the imperial, which had become the Indian civil service under the British, and converted it into the Indian Administrative Service, the IAS, as well as, of course, the Foreign Service and the Police Service. And he said to the first batch of the Indian civil services under independence, namely the IAS, your predecessors were brought up in traditions which kept them aloof from the common run of the people, because they were agents of an imperial authority. It will be your bounden duty to treat the common man as your own. So the main difference in the ethos between the imperial civil service, even though they called it the Indian civil service, and the Indian Administrative Service was meant to be that for the IAS as opposed to the ICS, the well-being and welfare of the common Indian citizen was supposed to be his or her first priority. And this, in many ways, is the key to the vision of civil service in independent India, and is meant to lay the foundation for good governance in our country. So what are the elements that you want to see and what India would like to see in a robust bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that is strong and effective? Transparency. You have to be visible to the people and be making fair, objective judgments that benefit everyone equally without fear or favor. Accountability. Thanks to the RTI, we now have that by law, but the fact is you are accountable upwards to your political masters and your bosses in the bureaucracy, downwards to the public, to whom you are rendering services and performing your duties. Responsiveness. A bureaucrat would fail, in my view, if he or she doesn't respond to requests from the public. Now, this is a contentious issue. I remember getting upset with one of my civil servants in the Ministry of Human Resource Development because a letter that had come in a month previously had still not been replied to. And he rather brazenly said to me, "Sir, if we spent all our days replying to all the letters that come in, we wouldn't get any work done." And I had to say to him, "This is part of your work. It may be too much, but it has to be done. Delegate some of your work, but make sure that everyone who writes to the ministry gets a reply." Of course, I don't know if that's happened or it's continued to happen, but that is a real challenge. Many in the bureaucracy have been trained to believe that responding to the public is an optional extra. I believe it's very necessary. A high level of integrity, that's extremely important. And of course, it's a controversial issue in our country where allegations of corruption have bedeviled our bureaucracy for a very long time. But the high level of integrity is something that's indispensable, because when you have a government servant, a bureaucrat, making a decision, executing an action, choosing amongst various people, if there is a perception that his decisions or her decisions are swayed by untoward factors, including bribes or other considerations, then the public loses faith in government, and faith's lost once cannot easily be won back. So it's very, very important to have a high level of integrity. The ethos and commitment towards public service. This is the final point, and it's a very important point because there are sadly some people in our bureaucracy who've gone in for the wrong reasons. Some have gone in because it's a prestigious job, high stakes in the marriage market if you're an IAS officer. Some have gone in because it is a secure job. The assumption is you can never be fired once you've got in. It's almost entirely true. Some have gone in particularly into services like customs and revenue and taxes because of the financial incentives on offer, bonuses if you catch smugglers and you catch tax cheats and so on. So there's extra money that might come in. And in the old days, some went in for the glamour of foreign travel, which was quite rare in those days. That was a foreign service. But the real reason that we want bureaucrats to go into public service is the faith that their fulfillment in life will best come from serving the Aam Aadmi and the Aam Aurat of India, the ordinary Indian citizen. And these are the most important pillars that we'd like to see in our country. Now, there have been changes. It's been 75 years since independence this year. I beg your pardon, 73 years since independence. It will be in 2 months' time. But the fact is that bureaucracy has evolved in these 73 years. Its size, its complexity, and its function. Size in India is a controversial issue. It has become enormous. Complexity, yes, because the nature of governance has become much more complex. In every ministry and every service, there are more tasks than were performed in the late 1940s when we won our independence. There are new developments, new innovations, and of course, new ways of doing things as well as new technologies to master the entire business of internet governance, e-governance, issuance of apps, and so on, are completely new. What some people have brought in are new ideas that are worth mentioning. Committed bureaucracy is a very important idea. It began when Indira Gandhi first talked about a committed bureaucracy, but it's got to be made very clear that it should not be linked to the wishes and preference of any government or any politician, because commitment should be commitment to the objectives, ideals, institutions, and modalities of the Constitution. The policies and programs of the government and the laws, the government of the day will change, but while they're the government, their policies will go on, and the laws, regulations, and rules of the executive issues. The fact is that that if you really were to look objectively at all this, we know that the fault lies with my tribe, with the politicians, who tend to say, you have to be committed to me, you have to be committed to my politics, to my party's view of seeing things. And that, I believe, is damaging, because that's not what the idea of commitment in a bureaucracy should be all about. If the bureaucrat is committed faithfully to upholding the principles of the Constitution and of Indian democracy, and of course does not challenge the policies of the government, because the government has been elected by the Indian public to follow its policies, not yours, or not another set of policies, then your job is to implement them without fear or favor. And sometimes our bureaucrats don't always do that. There are newer challenges. I've already mentioned RTI, which has done a great deal to enhance accountability in our system. Data privacy is an extremely important element. There is no question that when you look at the way in which the government is collecting vast amounts of data from the public, Aadhaar is a very good example. But there's also, as you all know, data coming in from every sort of form you fill, every application you make, everything you transact with the government, and how that's used by the government. What principles are followed are very important. I introduced a private member's bill in Parliament that would respect two very important principles. First, the data belongs to you, the person who generates it. And second, that the government may only use the data for purposes specified by law and must give up the data when that purpose is over. So data can be retained for the purposes of issuing you a passport, but they can't use it tomorrow to chase some other aspect of your personal life. Now, those principles are not yet enshrined in legislation. There is a much more disappointing data privacy bill the government has introduced, which is before a select committee of Parliament today. And it'll be interesting to see what version of the bill they come back with and what changes they make so that these principles are seriously upheld. Automation is becoming more and more of a factor. People are not necessarily encountering human beings and doing jobs. We're not as badly off as, say, the Western world, where very often if you call a government office, you get a machine, you get a robot's voice telling you, if you want this, press 1, if you want that, press 2. It happens in some places, but by and large in India, you can still reach bureaucrats directly. But automation is, of course, moving forward and will become more of a feature. The coronavirus crisis is another interesting example of the way in which the bureaucracy has risen to major challenges, because normal politics has in effect been suspended. So what's happening is that the bureaucracy has got into the business of governance without any parliamentary oversight, no committees seeing them or asking questions, no legislative processes, no direct parliamentary control, and a lot of decisions being made by bureaucrats. So these are, again, new challenges that time throws up, and there will be other ones, I'm sure, in time to come. One interesting development in the whole business of bureaucracy in India has happened post-liberalization, because before liberalization, everything required government permissions. We had, for example, permissions to be granted at every stage of the process of setting up a business, every stage of deciding whether you are allowed to manufacture a particular product, to export a particular product, to sell a particular product. So because there was so much red tape and so many stages in which permission was required, bureaucrats had more power of intervention than became possible after liberalization, when indeed bureaucrats were suddenly deprived of the power to permit in many cases. Of course, they still have regulatory rules across our system, but that has come down a bit, and that in turn is a consequence of the changing ethos of our economic policy system. And the changing role of the administration as democratic decentralization has taken place. We've had Panchayati Raj legislation in our country, which has brought down a lot of democratic decision-making to the village level, allowed village chiefs and village councils and the wards of municipalities to take decisions that hitherto have been reserved for the bureaucracy. I still think that bureaucrats could give up more power. I've moved a private member's bill in Parliament suggesting we should have directly elected town mayors so that they would actually have the authority. Right now, if you want to set up, say, a business in China, you can go off to the town mayor, and the mayor has the authority to give you everything, the land, the permission, the factory sites, the electricity, the water, the sewage, the road out to your port or airport, even because it's a communist system, the workforce. Whereas in India, a mayor of a town has none of these powers. He or she is the glorified chairman of a helpless committee which doesn't have the power itself. Every decision requires multifarious views, and ultimately the power of the purse sits with an unelected bureaucrat, the municipal commissioner. I believe that should change in the interest of democratic decentralization in the towns, just as we now have Panchayati Raj in the villages, but that's another story. Now, there have been some negative trends in the bureaucracy, and I think we need to look at them very frankly, and this is where my own involvement as a minister, my bias will show through from that end of the spectrum, because I've looked at bureaucracy through the critical eye of somebody who's worked with them without being a bureaucrat in those roles. The one thing that I find frustrating about Indian bureaucracy is the emphasis of process over outcome, which is that bureaucrats tend to emphasize following rules and precedents rather than focusing on the outcomes that are beneficial to the public. So if you have a particular project that needs to get done to benefit 10,000 people of a poor community in a village, the bureaucrat looks up previous such projects, sees what the practices were, sees what's permitted on the file, makes sure the minutes are in order, ensures that all precedents are respected. And if you're trying to do something innovative and liberal to help people, the bureaucrat usually tends to be a source of an obstacle. And that emphasis on process, there's that terrible joke about doctors, the operation was successful, but the patient died. Very often in Indian bureaucracy, what happens very often is that the process is followed, the file is tip-top, spick-span, but the objective of the exercise was not achieved, nobody was helped, even though the file is in good order. So that's a real problem, one negative in the bureaucracy. The second is the lack of specialization. Indian bureaucracy rests on the cult of the transferable generalist. That is, everybody who joins the IAS is supposed to be able to do everything. So today they're a bureaucrat in the education department, tomorrow they're in civil supplies, the next posting may be in defense, the fourth may be in a home state running a district, and they come back and they work in civil aviation, and they're supposed to master the files within days of arriving in each new job. And this kind of generalist approach goes back to the British days, but it also makes sense in a more simple world than the one we live in today. Today, lack of specialization is a real curse, because the fact is that more and more issues require a certain amount of familiarity with specific issues. Take environmental negotiations. We used to just send our best diplomats out to negotiate, but they were coming up against other countries' negotiators who had studied the intricacies of environmental practice, environmental law, environmental experiences, and our people were foundering they needed to go out and get outside consultants. So I think it's important now that we allow at least some of our bureaucrats with the right sort of talent to specialize. Let somebody be an education specialist, rise up the ranks of the education ministry over a period of 10 or 20 years. Yes, a couple of postings back to the home state, but then come back to education, and eventually, if they're good enough, rise to head that ministry. Similarly, with any other specialized area, I mentioned environment and education, but it's very true of defense, where amateurs are making or failing to make important decisions that ensure the security of our people. A third element that's become particularly current in recent years after the corruption controversies that assailed UPA2 is the bureaucratic fear of being caught up retrospectively in corruption. Because the so-called coal scandal, the so-called 2G spectrum scandal, and so on, has resulted in bureaucrats being actually prosecuted, taken to court, even jailed. In many cases, bureaucrats with a reputation for complete incorruptibility have suffered because of a vindictive corruption campaign, often without substance and usually involving, in the end, ending up in court exoneration on issues where one side alleges corruption, comes to power and prosecutes those they have accused, and the accused turn out not to be corrupt, but in the meantime, bureaucrats' lives have been ruined. They've had to spend out of their pensions to defend themselves, and therefore many bureaucrats say, we're not going to do anything that seems even slightly out of line or beyond precedent or out of order, because if we do, we might face prosecution in the future. And that, I think, is an unfortunate development as well, the fear of corruption controversies. A sensitive issue and a difficult issue is political interference. There is no question that the power of transfer is the only power politicians have, because in fact, it is largely true, as I mentioned earlier, that our bureaucrats can't be sacked. They really would have to do something egregiously criminal and be caught doing it to be fired. But what they can be is transferred. So they keep doing things the ministers don't like. They may end up, there is a famous case of the bureaucrat in the Haryana cadre who's had 256 postings in his career, which is quite astonishing over 20 odd years. That means he's been transferred about 10 times a year from one posting to another. But he's stuck to his guns and taken decisions his political masters didn't like in almost every posting. Such things happen. But this has become a potential problem because instead of bureaucrats being encouraged to do their job without fear or favor, many of them have to now live with the fear of transfers, and the interference of politicians is unavoidable. The cultivation of political godfathers is the flip side of that. That is, some bureaucrats say, this politician looks like he's going to do very well in the future, let's attach ourselves to him, cultivate him. He is going to make sure that he will be our godfather and steer us upwards through our career. And there are too many examples of this. I don't want to take any names. That's also a bad habit, because in that case, again, the objectivity and administrative integrity you expect from a bureaucrat disappears when they are making decisions at the behest of somebody who they believe will be a godfather to them in their bureaucratic career. The politicization of appointments. This is something we've seen particularly, I'm sorry to say, with the present government. This is not a political speech. I've tried so far to avoid criticizing any party, but I was struck with the decision by this government when they came to power in 2014 that any outstanding officer who had served in the office of a UPA minister was ineligible for appointment in a BJP minister's office. And so we had a number of very able, skilled people who also had the institutional memory of their ministries being banished to their home state cadres because they were seen as tainted for having worked with the opposite party. That's most unfortunate, because bureaucrats were appointed by the UPA on the basis of their professional competence, and they could have been retained by the BJP on the basis of professional competence where the BJP saw fit. But I can give you my own example. My PS was picked up by the MOS home to be his PS. My colleague Salman Khurshid's PS was picked up by the Home Minister to be his PS, and both were asked to be repatriated to their home cadres because they had served UPA ministers. So that's something that's not very good. And on a slightly lighter note, there is the great bureaucratic power of inaction. Now, when I say that, it's because bureaucrats are famous for never saying no. You ask a bureaucrat anything, and his dutiful response is always, yes, sir, if you're a minister. There was a terribly sexist joke, and I hope the women listening to me will not mind. It goes back 30 or 40 years, and the sexist joke was about ladies who are being wooed by gentlemen, and the joke used to be that, how did it go? Yes, if she says no, she means maybe. If she says maybe, she means yes. If she says yes, she's no lady. That was the sexist joke. Well, the answer to that given by the IAS officers was, if he says yes, he means maybe. If he says maybe, he means no. If he says no, he's no bureaucrat. And that really very often is the situation that we have, because the bureaucracy learns not to say no, but then they choose not to do what they have said yes to. That is what I call the power of inaction. One of the favorite techniques of the bureaucrats that I've seen in action is to say they can't find the file, which is actually quite amusing, because I will overrule a bureaucrat, give him an instruction which is the opposite of what he has advised. He will say yes, sir, dutifully. 2 months later, I'll ask him if he's done what I asked him to do. He says, sir, we're looking for the file. We can't find it. A variation of that is when the bureaucrat says, sir, it's under consideration in the department. And that's a polite way of saying we've lost the file. Although the joke is, if he says it's under active consideration, it means they're really trying to find the file, which is another matter altogether. Then there are the honest bureaucrats who, when asked uncomfortable questions, will turn to you and say, Minister, do you want the truth or do you want something you can tell Parliament? The two are not always the same thing. And this is, I know I'm sounding cynical, and from a bureaucratic point of view, cynicism is merely what politicians call realists. That's what bureaucrats think they are. But of course, if a politician has the courage of his convictions, he or she should be able to stand up to the bureaucrats and tell them precisely what to do. And I've often found that bureaucrats in the government of India are really rather like office chairs. There are those that will fold up if you put enough pressure on them. There are those which will go round and round in circles. These swivel chairs that keep turning around. There are bureaucrats like that. And then there are chairs that are truly immovable. You would really need lots of people to lift them, and that's essentially the case with some bureaucrats as well. You can't move them. So I know I'm saying a few things that my bureaucratic friends won't like. There are also bureaucrats who get a lot of things done, and I don't want to get that wrong. The fact is that there's an old joke in the British show Yes Minister about bureaucracy, which said that with bureaucrats, they have a formula which is called the 4-stage formula in how to respond to a crisis. In stage 1, they say, nothing is going to happen, Minister. In stage 2, they say, well, something may be about to happen, but we don't need to do anything about it. We should just watch. In stage 3, they say, oh, maybe we should do something about it, but there's nothing we can do. It's not possible for us to do something about it. And at stage 4, the bureaucrat says, maybe there was something we could have done, but it's too late now. Now that is the 4th stage of handling a crisis, the power of inaction, as I call it, in the bureaucracy. And some Indian bureaucrats are absolutely past masters at that as well. Now, what are the reforms we need to look at in achieving a robust bureaucracy? Reformed recruitment and training, obviously, to prepare civil servants for unforeseen challenges is very important. I have to say that my own committee, when I was chairing the Committee on External Affairs of the Indian Parliament, recommended some very serious reforms in recruitment and training of the Foreign Service. We felt very strongly that the Foreign Service should be recruited with an eye to international service, to the skills required in a diplomat, and not from a one-size-fits-all examination. And of course, when it comes to the bureaucrat, the generalist we talked about earlier, there will be unforeseen challenges, but they need to be trained periodically to be kept up with the latest innovations in the field. The government of India has been pretty good at various levels of mid-career training. Every 10 years or so, our bureaucrats are sent off to refresher courses, places like the Indian School of Business, the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy for Administration in Missouri, and sometimes in foreign institutions. And that's very important, that kind of reform we're seeing now. A robust performance appraisal, I have to say, is almost impossible. Because our procedures are such that if you tell the truth in a performance appraisal, you're going to end up having serious problems with the bureaucrat, with other bureaucrats who stand by the bureaucrat, and with various other kinds of pressures on you. So the truth is, most of our performance appraisals are not terribly good. They're uniformly good, rather, I should put it the other way around. They tell everyone that they're very good or outstanding. There's hardly any poor appraisal I've ever seen in a performance appraisal in the government of India. And that means that what you really have is the power of... So if you're looking for a PS, for example, you never just look at the performance appraisals of the bureaucrats who are recommended to you. You ask around, what were they like? How did they work? Were they efficient? Were they problem solvers or problem creators? And the informal reputation that bureaucrats have is often the way in which actually you judge how they work. The attitude of innovation and technology adoption is rather important. Increasingly today, a bureaucrat who's unable to use a computer, a laptop, or a mobile phone is essentially today a useless bureaucrat. You need to be familiar with that level of technology, and if you are even better than that, you actually can make these things work and understand some of the techno-geek that is spoken by the experts who are trying to get the government to adopt or reject new technologies, and you have a talent and aptitude for that, you will go far in a bureaucracy, because In the 21st century, bureaucracy is going to require people who are capable of innovation, capable of understanding technology, and capable of adapting to it. Another reform is simplification of administrative procedures, rules, and regulations. It's, again, easier said than done. Even during the coronavirus, those of you who have read the circulars that came out during the lockdowns, particularly from the Ministry of Home Affairs, will tear their hair out in despair. They were incomprehensibly written in bureaucracies. Each rule would require a magnifying glass to parse and understand. The next circular seemed to contradict the provisions of the previous circular. Red tapeism is still rampant in our culture. And of course, ease of governance is not very much there. So we do have to understand that this is easier said than done, but it's important to try and do it nonetheless. Time-bound service delivery. I was a big booster of a citizens' charter that would actually give citizens the right to demand certain services within certain specified timeframes. So every death certificate has to be delivered within 10 days of somebody's dying. That would reduce the possibilities of corruption at the petty bureaucratic level, where somebody says, we know you can't get anything done in terms of settling your late father's estate without that certificate, so you better bribe us, otherwise you won't get the certificate. You'll be waiting months for it. Time-bound service delivery is essential. Grievance redressal is very important. Every government office needs to have a grievance number, a grievance portal, so that people who've been badly treated can make a complaint and have their complaint addressed. Lateral entry, that's another favorite issue of mine. I believe one of the best ways we can deal with complacency in the bureaucracy is through permitting lateral entry. That means people have acquired skills later in life. Maybe they didn't pass the examination in their 20s, but they acquired skills or experience in the real world. Let's say an advertising professional coming into the public relations or public information department of the ministry, or the public diplomacy department of the foreign ministry. Let's say somebody who spent a serious time becoming a Balochistan expert in a university could come in laterally into the foreign ministry or the defense ministry. Somebody who has become, as I mentioned earlier, an expert on environmental issues could be brought in laterally into our environmental negotiations. So these are the kinds of things we need to do more of. I raised in Parliament the issue of the shortage of trained archaeologists in the Archaeological Survey of India. Why not take people even past the entry age as mid-career archaeologists? And I was promised by the Minister for Personnel that this was an idea they would adopt, but I've seen no evidence they have done. So these are things we need to do, because we can refresh government. It may also reduce complacency amongst the existing civil service who think no one can challenge them. They are the fount of all wisdom because they're supposed to be the generalists and know everything. But if lateral entrants with expertise come into ministries, even on 5-year contracts or 10-year contracts, or then to make new careers in the bureaucracy, having come in laterally, it would be good for the service, and it'll also bring in expertise and real-world knowledge from the private as well as public sectors. So what are the ways forward? And then I'll take your questions. I know we are running a little late. I was to finish by now, but the fact is we began a bit late because of the audio problem. So I'll just say that in order to be an agent of change, the bureaucracy must have the capacity to forecast, project, and understand the direction and tempo of major or significant changes in the environment. That's, I think, fairly self-explanatory, so I won't spend time on that. To plan for necessary and desirable changes. If you don't have the capacity to not just look ahead, but to actually plan for what you need to do to be ready to cope with those changes, then you're not a very good government officer. To adapt itself to changes, I've talked about this earlier in the talk, demanded or planned by the political system or really by the world at large. One of my favorite statistics of recent years is the Oxford Martin study that said by 2030, 30% of the jobs in the world will be jobs that don't exist today. So just as we can't educate our young children to do jobs that don't exist, all we can do is equip them not with what to think, but how to think. Similarly, the same holds true for bureaucrats. We need them to be able to be skilled at how to think, how to adapt themselves to the new things they'll have to think about and work on. And that means, of course, finally to learn and to innovate on their own. Now, we've had hundreds of questions coming in during the talk. It's impossible to respond to all of them in the very limited time available. I will respond to the questions that Unacademy and the Hindu have selected from the questions they have received. Somebody has asked, I don't know who the questioners are, how do you see the role of India in global politics in the years to come? How much prepared are we as a change-making nation? I think the role could be enormously influential. I've written an entire book about this, which is called The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative. It came out in January 2020, but all the big launch and discussion events didn't take place because of the lockdown. We had a few virtually that you can find on YouTube. But the core argument is that India can play a big role in remaking the world order of today, that we have the capacity, the human resources, the technological skills, the financial resources, and the know-how generally to be influential on the global stage in a whole range of areas from cyberspace to outer space. But we need to be able to be prepared, as the questioner asks, and to have the courage and the political will to step forward and play such a role. And India has not so far shown the ability to do that, principally because we've been distracted both by internal problems of political division, communal bigotry, and other issues at home, and of course now by the challenges on our borders, both from Pakistan and now from China, which have confined us within our limited space and prevented us perhaps from playing the global role we are capable of playing. But in the long term, it is something we should aspire to, and if I had anything to do with it, we would prepare very much for playing such a role. What advantage does our country get when bureaucrats join politics? To be public representatives. It's a tough question to answer because our system, like all parliamentary systems, is actually built on a watertight division between bureaucracy and politics. The politicians are the public representatives who go out amongst the people, get elected, come in and represent their views. The bureaucrats are the professional administrators whose job it is to be neutral, to be above the political fray, to implement policies. In practice, as the questioner says, many officers nowadays are joining politics. So the question about that is indeed a difficult one to answer, because obviously if every bureaucrat came into politics, then politics would become bureaucratic, or bureaucracy would become politicized even more than it already is. But there have been some very many honorable exceptions. We know the case of Mr. Yashwant Sinha, who left bureaucracy before retirement and became a very successful politician in serving as minister in two governments of India, including as foreign minister and finance minister. We have cases of foreign service officers. Currently, Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, and Hardeep Puri, the civil aviation and urban development minister, are both former foreign service bureaucrats. In both cases, came into the Rajya Sabha after retirement. But Mr. Natwar Singh, before then, actually left before retirement in order to become a politician. So there are very good examples of successful bureaucrats. KG Alphonse is another example, someone who left the IAS in mid-career and joined politics. Today we have an IAS officer called Kannan Gopinathan who left the IAS and is making strongly political speeches around the country and attracting quite a youth following. So I don't think one can give you a blanket answer. I think in principle these are two different compartments, but very occasionally if a bureaucrat wants to test his or her luck in the political fray because they believe that bureaucracy limits them too much, I don't think one can stand in any case in their way. In a free country, in a democracy, they have the right to ask people to choose them. And if people decide they want such a person to represent them, then certainly we should not be saying no. What will the country gain? It will gain obviously some professional expertise and a professional mindset. What will it lose? It will lose such a mind in the bureaucracy to implement policies better. But that's the 50-50 trade-off. And I think this is the final question. Due to the lockdown and the economic crisis, government revenue has declined significantly. True. Government recruitments are suffering. UPSC declared 0 vacancies for the Indian Economic Services. This may affect interests of lakhs of students and create social unrest given the large youth population and unemployment. What are your views? Well, I think it's a temporary phenomenon. I think government inevitably recruits because people inevitably retire. And except for the one period when government raised retirement age to 60, and now there is pressure, understandable pressure to revise that retirement age to 62, I think that except for when people serve longer, automatic retirements come in and therefore automatic recruitments have to take place. So I think what happened with the economic services is a relative exception. The other services are by and large recruiting. But you're right that one needs constant replenishment. And my own view is that the government of India could easily afford to cut back on the sort of chaprasi kind of functions, the lower divisional clerk, the peon who carries files from office to office, reduce the number of those posts and improve what's called in the military the teeth to tail ratio. These folks are the tail, the officers are the teeth, and they are the ones who will absolutely have to take the decision. So we should be able to preserve and even increase the number of professional officers by reducing, I think, the people who are serving tea and moving files, automate some of that, do more things, move files electronically, and you'll be able to hire more officers instead. But I don't think that we can afford to eliminate the government. Actually, as a government, in terms of the size of our population, our government is by no means too large. It is, in fact, a rather modestly sized bureaucracy in India. And it seems to me that we should be able to continue recruitment. So, there were two more questions. You've always pushed for an increase in the number of diplomats for India, and you also demanded a separate IFS exam. Could you please explain how a restructured IFS would benefit India? Yes. Sorry I'm running so late, but I didn't realize there were two more questions. Number one, on the foreign service, I will say to you very frankly, it's embarrassing we have such a small foreign service. The Indian foreign service is about the size of the foreign service of New Zealand or Singapore, much smaller countries. We need far more diplomats in too many embassies around the world. We have 103 embassies, but in many of them we have just one international officer assisted by a lower level or clerical or attaché level staff. That isn't good enough. We really need to have more top-notch, well-trained diplomats. Why did I ask for a separate IFS exam? Because I don't want diplomats representing India abroad whose real ambition was to be a policeman or a customs officer, but couldn't get it and they got stuck with a foreign service they didn't want. Because such people would not serve India well with the enthusiasm, knowledge, commitment, and talent we need. Secondly, because what we require in the current UPSC examination, which is a one-size-fits-all examination, what we require is something that absolutely does not look at the kinds of talents a diplomat would need. A diplomat needs curiosity about the world, an aptitude for foreign languages, an articulation which is necessary to persuade others about your point of view, an ability to get along with people of different cultures. We've had people picked for the foreign service who could barely speak Hindi because they only spoke the dialect of their village in a Hindi-speaking state. And you're expecting them tomorrow to go and charm a Frenchman or a Russian diplomat. It's not going to work so well. So these are, again, challenges. Personal qualities are important in diplomacy that may be less important in some of the domestic services. And finally, a restructured IFS exam, I would allow for example, our NRIs based in Dubai or Kuwait or London or Paris holding Indian passports to also take a foreign service examination. They may not be the best people to serve in the IAS or the IPS, but they can be very good because they've already lived abroad amongst foreigners, speak foreign languages, have grown up with foreign languages, and could be an asset for us. Currently, we don't do enough of that. So these are all the different reasons that I have. So far, the UPSC has not agreed with our suggestion, but these suggestions are in the report of the Committee of the Parliament, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, published on the subject, and I urge all of you interested, particularly this questioner who asked this question, to look it up. And now the final question is, COVID-19 has given us a 5-year window to revolutionize India's domestic higher education horizons. How can we improve our higher education? I'm sorry to tell you, this is an impossible question to answer in the couple of minutes remaining. There's a lot we need to do. Our higher education is over-regulated and under-governed. I believe we need to move to an accreditation model. We do not need to have a UGC telling every university how many years each course must be, how large their classrooms, how many teachers, what syllabus. That should be left to the universities. We should actually allow higher education to be far more autonomous, far more flexible. Let universities grow without the over-regulation that takes place now. Monitor the outcomes, monitor what quality of products they produce, what kind of papers they publish, what sort of reputation they get, how many more students they attract. Do you know that the Indian School of Business till very recently couldn't even issue a degree? because they didn't fit into the regulations and they were only allowed to give a diploma, even though many students consider them amongst the best school of business in the world. So here you have a challenge where our system is too rigid. And I think the short answer is lift regulation, improve accreditation, focus on learning outcomes, increase autonomy, and let the thousand flowers bloom. Thank you all very, very much. I think we've had a rather intense hour. I think 5 out of over 500 questions you all sent. So I apologize to all of those who couldn't reach me. Many have asked, how can they contact my office? It's very simple. It's office@tharoor.in by email. But please don't flood us. Give us a little time to look at what you're saying and respond. But thank you very much. Good luck to all of you who are joining the bureaucracy and serving the people of India. Remember, above all, that what matters is service. Everything else is secondary. Good luck in creating a robust bureaucracy. Jai Hind.